So today is my third video on how Parliament works as an institution, and it's going to be on the the officers of Parliament, the members of Parliament, who's who in Parliament, because we hear terms thrown around like Usher of the Black Rod or Speaker, and not that many people know really what the job is. You just hear that job given. At the core, so let's begin. At the core of our parliamentary democracy is the member of parliament and the member and senators. That's it. And people say, senators, why are they part of the democracy? Well, let's get to that. So let's begin with members of parliament. Members of parliament are members of the lower house of the tricameral legislature. So there are elected members from a single member constituency using the first past the post system. That probably confused 90% of the people out there going, what on earth are you talking about? Okay, easy peasy. Members of parliament are elected from a riding or electoral district. The word riding comes into Canadian politics from the British use of the word riding to describe the electoral district. And in Britain, there was a time when the ridings were the amount you could ride in one day on horseback. We use a little bit more complicated formula, where the ridings are decided by what's called an Electoral Commission, made up of a judge, who's the chair, an academic, and a other person. Some citizenry, and they make out the ridings maps. They have to do something called effectual representation in those riding maps. You may have heard of different theories of representation. Effectual representation basically means that, for lack of a better term, no one's getting screwed here. There's some common bound in the writing. It prevents mainly that it's not gerrymandered. So members of parliament are really expected to have two functions. The first is a public function. The public function is not their main function, but it's what gets them elected, and it's really what keeps them in office. So they're expected to do things like, go to birthday parties for 80-year-olds and stuff like that. And, this generally be part of the communities which they represent. Canada Day is coming up. Most members of parliament are going to be very busy on Canada Day, going all across their ridings, probably having more Canada Day cake than would make a normal person sick, and singing "O Canada" so many times that it gets stuck in their head, which, by the way, I've done. Very annoying. Not that "O Canada" is annoying or anything, but when it gets stuck in your head, yeah, no. And the second role of members of parliament is something that they share with the senators, and that is parliamentary role. So they are expected to be there for sittings of the House of Commons and the Senate. They're expected to debate legislation. They're expected to understand the legislation before them. They're expected to be part of parliamentary committees. They're expected to vote. They're expected to understand the matters before them. And they're expected to hold the government to account individually and collectively as the House of Commons. Senators are appointed. In the Canadian system of government, they are appointed by what's called the Governor and Council, which is really the Governor General on the advice of the Prime Minister. They are sometimes party hacks, but this isn't always the case. It really depends on who appoints them and how they're appointed. They collectively do not have ridings, except in Quebec. Quebec's a little different. We're not going there. If you want to go there, please read up on it, but we're not. But they have geographical areas. And there's 4 geographical areas in Canada, each having 24 senators, and it's broken down by province. The interesting thing is that no province can have more senators, no more MPs than they do senators. So PEI has 4 senators. The least number of MPs they can have is 4 MPs. Because if they were to actually have a general, have the rest of the country's level of representation, they would have less than 4 MPs. They would probably have 1 MP. But because they have 4 senators, the minimum they have is 4 MPs. So the members of Parliament get together and form a House of Commons, and the first thing they do is elect a Speaker role. And the Speaker's role is really to preside over the House of Commons, to make rulings on very important things, such as the privileges of the House, whether a bill is in order, whether a private member's bill is in order, if someone's behavior is so grossly inappropriate, it offends the House and that person should be disciplined. But not on the actual discipline, that's the House itself. A lot of people assume that just because the Speaker rules away, that's actually what's going to happen. It's not the case. When it comes to the privileges of the House, the only sole judge of the privileges of the House is the House itself. So the Speaker can rule one way or another, but it's actually the House that decides on what's going on. Senate's a little bit different. Senate, the Speaker is the first among equals. The Speaker sometimes makes rulings, but it's actually the House itself that decides it. It's the Senate that decides it. And when you address the Senate as a senator, you do not say Mr. Speaker, you say Honorable Senators, because the Senator is just the first among equals. The Speaker is just the first among equals. In the Senate, the Speaker votes. In the House of Commons, the Speaker cannot vote unless there's a tie. And then he must use a series of rules called Denton's rules to decide his vote. Denton's rules is basically 3 rules. A bill must be left in its current form rather than amended to let it be amended at a future date. The Speaker should always vote to continue debate so that decisions can be made by the majority. If debate cannot be continued further, then the Speaker should vote to end debate so that decisions are made by the majority. So the example of this would be second reading of the budget. The Speaker would have to vote in favor of it to continue debate. Third reading of the budget? No. The Speaker would actually have to vote against it to allow decisions to be made by the majority. That decision would not have been made by the majority, therefore, no. Each party in the House of Commons, which is any recognized political party with more than 12 seats, have a few officers they have to appoint. The first is their leader. There must be a leader in the House. So, I think it was in Ontario, you had a party leader, but that party leader wasn't in the House. It was not, in Ontario we call them MPPs. There was not an MPP that was the party leader in the House. So you actually had a leader of the government in the House, of the party in the House. The same is true with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister need not be a member of the House of Commons technically. So when Mackenzie Ball was Prime Minister, he was a senator. And there was a leader of the government in the House of Commons, and then the Prime Minister was in the Senate. The same could be true if a party leader was elected, became Prime Minister, but did not have a seat in the House. That person, there would be a leader of the government in the House of Commons, a leader of the government in the Senate, and then the party leader would be something different. And the party leader is really a chief spokesperson for that person, that party in the House of Commons. Then there's the whips. The whips are really in charge of disciplining and making sure members show up for votes, vote the way they're supposed to vote, stuff like that. The next one is we're getting to the officers of Parliament. And I'm not talking officers as in big old officers of Parliament. I'm talking small officers of Parliament. I'm talking the procedural officers of Parliament. The big O officers of Parliament is something completely different, and don't have time in this video to talk about them. So the clerk of the House of Commons and the clerk of the Senate and clerk of the Parliaments, both have more or less have the same job, and that they are procedural experts whose job it really is to ensure that the House of Commons function in accordance with the authorities. I've mentioned the authorities before. These are those pieces of works which basically say how Parliament should function, and their job is more or less to advise the Speaker on how it should function. The clerk also has a role in the election of the Speaker. The Speaker is elected by the members of the House of Commons who, from a number of candidates who have not written the clerk saying they're not interested in the Speaker's job, or who has more or less said, no, we're disqualified. Members of cabinet, leaders are disqualified. There's a whole bunch that are disqualified from being the Speaker. Under the clerk, there's a number of deputy clerks, and there's an deputy clerk called the law clerk, and that person is an expert in parliamentary law, usually a lawyer, and they have the title Parliamentary Counsel as an SEL counsel. And their job is to advise the Commons, the committees and stuff on the legal aspects of their rights and responsibilities, including their privileges. So when you saw the contempt proceedings earlier this year, you actually saw the law clerk and parliamentary counsel in there talking to the committee on their rights and privileges. The two more officers, first is the Sergeant at Arms, or in the Senate, the Gentleman Usher of the Black Rod of the Senate of Canada. Both of these officers really has a role in ensuring the physical grounds around the members of Parliament when they are sitting are safe. There's ceremonial roles to this job too. The House of Commons has a ceremonial role of carrying the mace. The Senate, the Usher of the Black Rod of the Senate of Canada's role is kind of interesting because he's also the Secretary of the Queen of Canada, and he's probably most famous for knocking on the House of Commons doors 3 times to summons them. We mainly only see this publicly when you have an opening in Parliament, but this can also be to get royal assent. If you watch the video for Sunday sitting of Parliament, I really recommend you do. You'll actually see the Usher of the Black Rod, the Deputy Usher of the Black Rod, come in and knock to summons the Commons to hear royal assent. And as the Secretary to the Queen of Canada, his role is also to do things like arrange royal visits, arrange the installation of the Governor General with Heritage Canada, but he's really the major coordinator of all those things. And the Sergeant at Arms of the House of Commons after Gus Clayton died, who was Sergeant of Arms for almost 40 years, World War II I believe it was, he died in office, and it was vacant for about a year, and then they have a new Sergeant of Arms. But he was actually the Secretary of the Queen of Canada. So it's not necessarily the Usher, the Black Rod of the Senate of Canada that is the Secretary of the Queen, but it's one of those two. The final officer, smaller officer of Parliament that needs to be noted here is the Librarian of Parliament. The Librarian of Parliament is an appointee of both the Senate and the House of Commons, and their job is to basically the Library of Parliament. If you've ever been to the Parliamentary Precinct, the library is actually the oldest part of the Parliamentary Precinct of the Central Block. And I think it's one of the most beautiful parts of the Parliamentary Precinct of the Central Block. And the librarian, most people don't know this, but any work which has ever been mentioned in Parliament is kept in the Library of Parliament for reference. So if you mention this video in the House of Commons, and I know there may be some MPs watching, a copy of it would actually be saved in the Library of Parliament. It's kind of cool. Theses are sent to the Library of Parliament and the National Archives. The National Archives and the Library of Parliament has almost the identical collection. The difference is the Library of Parliament can only be used by MPs and senators and their staffs. That's it. So that's a look at the who's who in Parliament. There's the big old officers of Parliament, things like the Auditor General, Chief Electoral Officer, the Language Commissioners. I don't want to go into those. It's already a 17-minute video by the time I've wrapped things up. I'll do another video on those. I hope everyone has a wonderful Canada Day, and I hope everyone enjoyed this video.